The coffee's gone cold beside you. Not because you forgot it, because your mind left the room 20 minutes ago. Somewhere between the sound of a door closing too hard and the silence that followed after. You know that silence. The kind that forces your nervous system to become a surveillance camera. You notice everything now. The shift in someone's breathing, the fake smile that comes half a second too late, the sentence that sounds harmless to everyone else, but lands in your chest like a coded warning. And maybe people call you smart, but what they don't understand is this. You didn't learn people from books. You learned them from survival. You learned how to read emotional weather before the storm arrived. You learned how to predict danger from footsteps in a hallway. You learned how to memorize moods the way soldiers memorize escape routes. Because somewhere in your life, being unaware came with consequences. And the terrifying part is, the pain didn't just wound you, it trained you. There's a form of intelligence the world almost never talks about. It doesn't come from universities. It doesn't come from IQ tests. It doesn't announce itself loudly in conversations. It's born in environments where the human mind had to evolve emotionally just to stay alive. Traumatic intelligence, the rarest kind. Because the people who carry it usually don't even realize they have it. They just think they're too sensitive, too observant, too intense, too hard to relax. But sensitivity was never your weakness. It was your nervous system learning how to survive before your mouth was old enough to explain what was happening to you. And the first sign? The first sign is something most people will never notice about you at all. You can feel emotional shifts before words are ever spoken. You walk into a room and immediately know when something's wrong, even if everyone's smiling. And no, it's not magic. It's pattern recognition sharpened by emotional exposure. People with traumatic intelligence develop a hyper-attunement to human behavior because, at some point in life, missing emotional signals became dangerous. A child raised in emotional unpredictability becomes an expert in micro-expressions. An emotionally neglected person becomes fluent in silence. Someone who grew up around anger learns how to detect tension from the smallest movement in another person's jaw. Your brain adapted. But adaptation has a cost. Because now your nervous system rarely rests. Even in safe environments, your body still scans for hidden meaning. You overanalyze pauses. You study tone changes. You notice when someone says, "I'm fine," with their words, while their eyes quietly confess something else entirely. And people think you're overthinking. But what they don't realize is that your mind was trained in a battlefield they never saw. Traumatic intelligence creates emotional detectives, not because you wanted to become one, because your survival depended on it. That's why you can often sense betrayal before evidence appears. You can feel disconnection before relationships officially end. You notice emotional distance long before anyone admits it exists. And here's the strange part. You often know people better than they know themselves. Not because you're controlling, not because you're manipulative, because you became deeply aware of human contradiction. You learned early that what people say and what people feel are rarely the same thing. So you stopped listening only to language. You started listening to energy, timing, facial tension, eye contact, silence, especially silence. People with traumatic intelligence understand something most of the world ignores. Silence is never empty. Sometimes silence is fear. Sometimes it's resentment. Sometimes it's grief sitting quietly in the corner of the room pretending not to exist. And you feel it all, which is why crowded rooms can exhaust you. You're not just hearing conversations, you're processing emotional frequencies constantly. And over time, this creates a strange loneliness, because you begin realizing how much of human interaction is performance. You notice the friend forcing laughter while secretly falling apart. You notice the couple pretending to love each other while resentment leaks through every glance. You notice the person acting confident while shame quietly controls every decision they make. And eventually, you stop feeling fully present around most people. Because you can see the mask and the wound underneath it at the same time. That level of awareness changes you. It makes small talk feel unbearable. It makes fake connection feel physically exhausting. It makes you crave honesty with an intensity other people mistake as too deep. But depth isn't your problem. Depth became your refuge. Because shallow environments are dangerous for people who learn to survive through emotional accuracy. And maybe this is why your intuition scares people sometimes. You notice what others desperately try to hide from themselves. Not loudly, quietly. You feel the emotional fracture underneath the polished exterior. You hear pain hiding inside humor, fear hiding inside arrogance, abandonment hiding inside control. And the hardest part? Most people don't want to be seen that clearly. Because traumatic intelligence gives you an almost surgical perception of human behavior. But it rarely teaches you how to turn that perception off. So even when life becomes calmer, your mind keeps listening for alarms that no longer exist. And sometimes, late at night, when the world finally becomes quiet enough, you begin to wonder whether this intelligence is actually a gift, or just pain wearing the mask of wisdom. And that question changes everything. There's a moment that happens to people with traumatic intelligence that almost nobody talks about. It usually happens in relationships. Not during the beginning. The beginning is easy. You know how to become what people need. You know how to listen deeply, how to make others feel emotionally safe, how to notice what hurts them before they even say it out loud. You learned that skill long ago. Because when you grow up studying human behavior for survival, you become exceptional at emotional adaptation. You become emotionally useful. And people love emotionally useful people. At first. But eventually something strange begins to happen. You start realizing that while you can read everyone else with terrifying accuracy, almost nobody can read you. Not fully, not deeply, not the way you read them. And that creates the second sign of traumatic intelligence. You feel chronically misunderstood, even when you're deeply loved, because your mind operates beneath the surface of most conversations. Someone asks how your day was, but your brain isn't thinking about the day. It's thinking about the shift in someone's voice from 3 hours ago. The hidden meaning behind a sentence nobody else noticed. The emotional tension that entered the room and changed everything without explanation. Your inner world is layered, complex, hyper-connected. And over time you realize most people interact with life at the surface level while you're drowning in emotional subtext. So you begin translating yourself into simpler versions just to survive socially. You laugh when you want to disappear. You say, "I'm tired," when the truth is your nervous system feels hunted. You say, "It's fine," because explaining the full emotional architecture inside your head would take hours. And you already know most people wouldn't understand anyway. That's the hidden loneliness of traumatic intelligence. You become fluent in everybody else's emotional language, while secretly feeling like nobody speaks yours. And this often starts in childhood. Children exposed to emotional instability learn very quickly that expressing too much truth can create danger. So they adapt. They become careful, measured, observant. They stop asking, "Will people understand me?" and start asking, "How much of myself is safe to reveal?" That question follows you into adulthood, into friendships, into love, into every room you enter. You become highly aware of how people perceive you, not from vanity, from survival. You can sense when someone's energy changes toward you instantly. You notice when warmth becomes distance. You notice when attention becomes irritation. You notice when someone stops seeing you and starts projecting onto you instead. And because your nervous system notices these shifts so quickly, you often pull away before conflict even begins. Not because you're cold, because your body remembers what emotional danger feels like. This is why people with traumatic intelligence sometimes disappear emotionally without warning. They don't always explain. They retreat. Because somewhere in their past, explaining themselves didn't create safety. It created punishment. And what's heartbreaking is that many highly perceptive people secretly feel emotionally invisible. Think about that. The person who notices everything feels like nobody notices them. The person who deeply understands others feels deeply unknown. The person everyone calls strong quietly wishes someone would finally ask the right question. Not, "What's wrong?" but, "How long have you been carrying this alone?" Because traumatic intelligence often creates emotional self-sufficiency long before emotional healing ever begins. You become the calm one, the wise one, the emotionally composed one. But underneath that composure is usually a nervous system that learned very early that vulnerability had consequences. So instead of expressing pain, you intellectualize it. You analyze it, study it, dissect it. You become incredibly articulate about emotions while remaining emotionally unreachable at the exact same time. And people can feel that contradiction around you. They feel warmth from you, but also distance, depth, but guardedness. It's like standing near a fire behind glass. And the exhausting part is, you often want closeness more than anyone else. But closeness requires surrender, and surrender feels dangerous to a nervous system trained through emotional unpredictability. So you test people quietly, not manipulatively, subconsciously. You watch consistency, tone changes, patience, reaction speed, eye contact, emotional presence, because your body is asking one question over and over again. Are you safe enough for me to stop scanning? And very few people ever pass that test. Not because people are evil, but because most people have never learned how to sit inside emotional depth without trying to escape it. So you become selective, private, hard to fully reach, and eventually people start describing you with words like mysterious, intense, hard to read. Without realizing the truth is almost the opposite. You're actually reading everything, constantly. Until one day, you meet someone whose presence doesn't force your nervous system into defense, someone who doesn't rush your silence, doesn't fear your depth, doesn't punish your honesty. And for the first time in years, your mind stops trying to predict the next emotional earthquake, which is when you discover something terrifying. You were never actually too much. You were just never truly safe enough to be fully seen. And once a person with traumatic intelligence experiences emotional safety even once, they can never again pretend not to know the difference between connection and survival. There's something else that happens when a human being survives through emotional awareness for too long. They become dangerous to illusion. Not dangerous in a violent way, dangerous in a truthful way. Because the third sign of traumatic intelligence is this: you can no longer fully participate in denial. And that changes your entire relationship with the world. Most people survive psychologically by avoiding uncomfortable truths. They distract themselves, rationalize behavior, call manipulation love, call emotional absence independence, call chronic anxiety being busy. But when you've spent years studying human behavior from the inside of pain, you start seeing reality with unbearable clarity. You notice how many people are performing versions of themselves just to be accepted. You notice how often confidence is just fear wearing expensive clothing. You notice how some relationships survive not because of love, but because both people are terrified of abandonment. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's the curse. Traumatic intelligence strips emotional fantasy away from your perception. You stop hearing only words. You start hearing motive. You stop watching behavior. You start watching patterns, and patterns never lie for long. That's why people with traumatic intelligence often become incredibly difficult to manipulate. Not impossible, but difficult, because your brain remembers what manipulation feels like. It remembers guilt disguised as kindness, control disguised as protection, conditional love disguised as loyalty. So now, even years later, your nervous system reacts to emotional inconsistency before your conscious mind can explain why. You feel it in your stomach first, a strange tightening, a subtle internal alarm. Someone's smile doesn't match their eyes. Their energy shifts after gaining information about you. Their kindness suddenly feels transactional instead of genuine. And everyone else misses it. But you don't. Because your survival once depended on detecting emotional danger early. This is why highly traumatized people often appear psychic to others. But what people call intuition is often accelerated pattern recognition built through repeated emotional exposure. You learned the architecture of human behavior through repetition. Pain became your teacher. And painful teachers leave permanent lessons. The problem is, once you develop this level of perception, ordinary life becomes emotionally exhausting. You begin noticing how frequently people betray themselves. The person who says they want love but runs from intimacy. The person who claims confidence while secretly needing constant validation. The parent who says, "I did my best," while refusing accountability for the wounds they created. You notice contradictions everywhere, and eventually, your tolerance for dishonesty starts collapsing. Not just dishonesty from others, dishonesty within yourself. That's the part nobody prepares you for. Because traumatic intelligence eventually turns inward. One day you stop analyzing everyone else long enough to finally ask, what parts of me were built from survival instead of truth? That question can unravel an entire identity. You begin realizing that some of your personality traits were actually defense mechanisms in disguise. Your independence? Maybe it was hypervigilance. Your emotional control? Maybe it was fear of vulnerability. Your ability to stay calm during chaos? Maybe chaos became familiar so early that your nervous system stopped recognizing it as abnormal. And suddenly your intelligence becomes painful. Because awareness without healing can feel like drowning with your eyes open. You see everything, including yourself. That's why some deeply perceptive people isolate themselves. Not because they hate humanity, because they feel overstimulated by emotional falseness. Small talk becomes unbearable when your mind naturally searches for emotional truth. Surface-level relationships begin feeling physically empty. Even entertainment changes for you. You stop asking, "Is this impressive?" and start asking, "Is this real?" Real emotion, real intention, real connection, real accountability. And the deeper your perception grows, the smaller your circle often becomes. Because truth changes your tolerance. You stop forcing relationships that drain your nervous system. You stop begging emotionally unavailable people to understand you. You stop translating your soul into smaller language just to avoid making others uncomfortable. And strangely, that's when loneliness reaches its peak. Because healing doesn't immediately feel peaceful. At first, it feels like grief. Grief for how long you abandoned yourself to survive. Grief for how many environments trained your nervous system to fear rest. Grief for the younger version of you who thought love had to be earned through emotional labor. People with traumatic intelligence often carry enormous emotional exhaustion hidden beneath composure. Because they've spent years being emotionally awake in environments that rewarded numbness. And eventually, your body starts resisting anything fake. Fake conversations exhaust you. Fake friendships drain you. Fake versions of yourself become impossible to maintain. So your life begins changing. Quietly. Not through one dramatic moment. Through 1,000 tiny moments where your soul finally says, "No more pretending." And that's when the real transformation begins. Not when you become smarter. Not when you become stronger. But when you finally realize your hyper-awareness was never meant to imprison you inside survival. It was meant to guide you toward truth. Even if truth destroys everything your old identity once depended on. And in the next stage of this journey, you discover the most frightening thing of all. What happens when a person who spent their entire life emotionally surviving finally becomes emotionally free? There is a final stage people rarely talk about. Not because it's invisible, because almost nobody reaches it. Most people stay trapped somewhere between survival and self-protection for their entire lives. Their nervous system never fully leaves the battlefield. Even decades later, they're still reacting to ghosts disguised as ordinary moments. But some people eventually cross a line internally. And the fourth sign of traumatic intelligence is the rarest one of all. You stop needing pain to define your identity. At first, this feels terrifying. Because when survival has shaped your personality for years, healing can feel like losing yourself. Think about that. If hypervigilance made you smart, if emotional control made you safe, if overthinking made you prepared, then who are you without those defenses? That question creates an identity crisis most people never understand. Because traumatic intelligence often becomes intertwined with self-worth. You become proud of how much you can endure, how much you can perceive, how deeply you can analyze people. And secretly, you begin believing that your pain is the reason you're valuable. But eventually life teaches you something unexpected. Survival traits that once protected you can become prisons when the danger is over. And that realization changes everything. You start noticing how exhausted you are. Not physically, existentially. Tired of scanning every room. Tired of preparing for betrayal before it exists. Tired of treating love like a puzzle instead of an experience. Your body begins craving something unfamiliar. Peace. Not excitement. Not intensity. Not emotional chaos mistaken for passion. Just peace. And for a while, peace feels uncomfortable, almost suspicious, because people raised around unpredictability often associate calmness with emotional emptiness. You wait for the other shoe to drop. You question kindness. You mistrust consistency. Part of you keeps searching for hidden danger because your nervous system was trained to believe danger always arrives eventually. But healing begins the moment you stop worshiping your trauma as proof of your depth. Read that again internally. Your suffering may have sharpened your perception, but it was never meant to become your permanent identity. And this is where traumatic intelligence transforms into something extraordinary. Wisdom. Real wisdom. Not performative wisdom. Not internet quotes pretending to be enlightenment. Actual wisdom. The kind born when a human being has seen emotional darkness clearly, without becoming consumed by it. You begin understanding people differently. You stop needing to win emotionally. You stop trying to expose every lie. You stop carrying responsibility for saving broken people who refuse accountability. Because wisdom teaches discernment. You finally understand that seeing someone clearly does not obligate you to carry them. That lesson alone can liberate an entire life. People with traumatic intelligence often spend years unconsciously becoming emotional caretakers for everyone around them. You become the therapist friend, the stable one, the observer, the emotional translator. Because understanding pain made you compassionate. But mature healing teaches you a brutal truth. Compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction. And once you fully understand that, your relationships change forever. You stop chasing emotionally unavailable people. You stop explaining your worth to those committed to misunderstanding you. You stop abandoning your nervous system just to maintain connection. Instead, you become quieter, not weaker, clearer. There's a difference. Your energy stops reaching outward desperately and starts settling inward peacefully. And something remarkable happens when a traumatized nervous system finally experiences internal safety. Your intuition sharpens even more. But now it's no longer fueled by fear. It becomes grounded, calm, accurate without paranoia. You no longer read people because you're trying to survive them. You read them because you understand human nature deeply. That's the evolution. Fear creates hypervigilance. Healing creates discernment. One is exhausting. The other is power. And maybe the most beautiful part is this. You finally stop confusing chaos with love. That changes everything. For the first time in your life, you realize healthy connection feels almost unfamiliar. No mind games, no emotional whiplash, no constant anxiety about abandonment, just presence, consistency, truth. And at first it feels boring to the old version of you, because your nervous system was addicted to unpredictability. But slowly, your body learns a new language, safety. You begin sleeping differently, breathing differently, loving differently. You stop trying to earn rest. You stop apologizing for your depth. You stop shrinking your perception just to fit inside shallow environments. And one day, almost without noticing, you realize something incredible. The very pain that once convinced you the world was unsafe eventually became the reason you learned how to see through illusion, protect your peace, and recognize authentic love when it finally arrived. That is traumatic intelligence at its highest form. Not surviving pain, transforming it. Because the rarest people in this world are not the ones who were never wounded. The rarest people are the ones who were wounded deeply, but refused to let the wound become their final identity.